In the spring of 1893, the first drop appeared. It was not seen as an omen at first, only as a curiosity, a tiny bead of red gathering at the lower edge of the crucifix above the altar of St. Anselm's parish. The wood was pale oak, smooth and uncracked, and no one could explain how something wet could seep from its grain. At the Sunday communion, the sunlight streamed in through narrow stained-glass windows, falling across the altar in fractured colors, and the congregation saw it glint like a jewel. A child whispered to her mother that the cross was crying. The murmur moved like a current through the pews, and by the time the service ended, half the town had bent close to see for themselves. The drop had thickened into a smear. Some thought it a miracle. Others felt an unease they would not name. Father Willard Hayes, new to the parish and still finding his place among these rural families, stood motionless before it for longer than seemed natural. When he finally turned away, his expression was unreadable, but in his letter to the bishop that week, his words were sharp. "It is not a miracle. It is a reminder." No one but Hayes saw what came next. On the second Sunday, the bead of red was larger, as though it had not dried from the week before. Hayes wiped it with a cloth before Mass, folding the linen into a tight square and tucking it inside his cassock pocket. He kept it there as he delivered the homily, the faint dampness pressing against his chest. In private, he unwrapped it slowly, inhaling the iron scent. It reminded him of something he had learned years earlier in a seminary lecture. The ancient idea that blood, when captured from a holy site, carried the memory of the sin that had drawn it. That night, when the church was locked and the candles had burned low, he lingered in the sacristy, laying the cloth out on the table as if studying a map. He wrote nothing down, but he began to think in lists. Who sat where? Who met whose gaze? Whose knees bent reluctantly at the altar rail? The drop on the cross was not random. It was pointing. By the third week, a pattern began to take shape in the way Hayes moved through the parish. He visited certain homes unannounced, speaking warmly to the women, testing the children on their catechism, walking the fence lines with the men. His interest seemed pastoral, but his eyes were taking inventory. At night, he roamed the nave, staring up at the crucifix in the flicker of a single candle, waiting for the next sign. When the drop came again, it was darker, thicker, clinging to the carved foot of Christ. Hayes touched it with the tip of his finger and felt a heat that should not have been there. He did not flinch. Instead, he pressed that same finger to the open page of his Bible, leaving a small red mark beside the verse about the wages of sin. He began to believe the cross was speaking to him alone. The first death followed within days. A farmer named Nathan Phelps was found in the church cellar, his body upright in a chair, eyes open, hands folded as if in prayer. But his skin was the color of ash, and his mouth was filled with something dark. The coroner found the source. His tongue had been coated in a resin that hardened like stone, sealing it against his teeth and throat until he suffocated. Hayes led the funeral himself, speaking of the suddenness of death and the need for readiness. No one saw that as he anointed the coffin, a thin streak of red ran again from the cross above the altar, landing on the wood before the lid was closed. Whispers grew louder in the weeks that followed. Some said the drop was a blessing, a sign that the parish was chosen. Others remembered the stories of old, relics that bled only in times of great trial, saints' bones that wept before plague. Hayes encouraged neither belief nor doubt. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, the way a confession sits between priest and penitent before either speaks. He understood that uncertainty was a sharper tool than fear. By midsummer, the drop appeared every Sunday without fail. Hayes never let it dry on the wood. Each week he wiped it with a fresh cloth, always folding it in the same careful way. He kept the cloths in a locked drawer in the rectory, stacked in neat squares like a ledger of the parish's hidden sins. He had begun marking the corners with small notches. 1 for envy, 2 for lust, 3 for pride. The system was his own, a private catalogue of transgressions no one had confessed aloud. Then came the second death. A seamstress who had mended the altar cloths was found hanging in her workroom, suspended not by rope but by long, sharpened needles driven through the muscles of her back into the beams above. Her eyes were open, her lips sewn shut with her own crimson thread. The town told itself she had taken her life in shame, though no one could say for what. Hayes spoke at her burial about the garment of righteousness, how every stitch counted, how a single loose thread could unravel the whole. He did not look toward the cross that day, though the drop was larger than ever. The killings, though the parish never named them as such, bound the town in a strange silence. Each death seemed to follow the unspoken rhythm of the church calendar, each method a kind of dark liturgy. Hayes moved through it all with the calm of a man certain of his purpose. In his mind, the cross was not warning the parish, it was instructing him. The blood was the ink, the bodies the script. And as the summer deepened into the heavy stillness of August, Hayes began to wonder what would happen if he did not wipe the drop away at all, if he let it fall and spread, until it marked not just the altar but every soul who dared kneel before it. The thought lingered in him like a promise, one he meant to keep. Samuel Whitcomb arrived in St. Anselm's with the soft step of a man accustomed to being welcomed. He was in his late 50s, broad in the shoulders, hair silvered at the temples, and dressed in a manner that made him appear less a visitor than a fixture of the town. He carried with him the reputation of a benefactor, a man who had pulled mining towns from ruin and funded hospitals in cities no one visited unless they had to. His name preceded him like a candle flame in the dark, gentle, steady, and impossible to ignore. The parish had heard whispers that he intended to underwrite the new wing of the church, and Father Hayes greeted him with the warmth reserved for a man who could alter the shape of a community. Whitcomb's gaze swept the nave slowly like an appraiser measuring the worth of every beam, every stone, every soul in the pews. His voice was quiet, but when he spoke of faith and duty, people leaned in to hear, unaware that this too was part of his design. His generosity came with no outward demands. He wrote checks with a flourish, arranged shipments of brick and timber, and hired laborers from distant counties to keep the work moving. Yet behind this public benevolence lay a mind honed in a different trade altogether, the measured dismantling of the human spirit. Before Ohio, his fortune had grown in the shadows of institutions meant to reform the wayward and rehabilitate the criminal. These rehabilitation institutes were his pride, though he rarely spoke of them in detail. They had been built with the facade of mercy, tall windows, airy courtyards, and spotless wards. But below ground, where no visitor was ever taken, the air thickened with a silence so deep it became a presence. Prisoners were kept in isolation cells designed to remove not just comfort but orientation. The rooms had no corners, no seams, nothing to measure time or space. The walls absorbed every whisper, and the light was a constant, aching brightness that erased the sense of day or night. Food was delivered at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a day, sometimes once every 2 days, always enough to prevent death, never enough to feel sated. Whitcomb called this cleansing the mind of rebellion. The process was neither loud nor bloody. It was a slow unthreading of thought, a methodical erosion that left the body alive but the self hollowed. Some prisoners lasted weeks before their eyes began to lose focus. Others lasted months, their speech unraveling into murmurs, then into the reflexive recitation of prayers they did not understand. Those who broke entirely were not released. They were placed in what he referred to as endurance chambers, where shallow water stood ankle deep and the temperature dropped to just above freezing. Here the mind ceased to matter. Only the body's stubborn will to live remained, and even that could be trained to yield. In St. Anselm's, Whitcomb's methods were invisible to the town. He attended services, made small talk with merchants, and slipped folded bills into the offering plate. Yet he also spent long hours alone in the half-finished church wing, walking the perimeter of the foundation, tapping the stone with his cane as though listening for weaknesses. He had already decided where the hidden rooms would be built, where the walls would double back on themselves to create soundless spaces no one could reach without his knowledge. He studied the parishioners with the same eye he had used on prisoners, noting who lingered too long in the tavern, who left services before the final hymn, who avoided the confessional entirely. When the first accidental death occurred, there was no outcry. A vagrant laborer brought in from another county was found in the quarry pond, his body pale and bloated, his hands raw as if from scraping against stone. It was said he had been drunk and lost his footing. Hayes spoke of repentance and the brevity of life, but Whitcomb knew the man's last days had been spent in one of the temporary storage sheds by the quarry, its windows nailed shut, the air heavy with lime dust. The slow suffocation had been enough to strip the man's mind to its last threads before his lungs gave way. Whitcomb carried no guilt for this. To him such deaths were not mistakes but refinements, each one a step toward perfecting the conditions under which the human will collapsed. He believed that faith was not built in comfort but in breaking, that only when a person was stripped to the marrow could they truly understand devotion. The cross in the parish bled for sin. Whitcomb's work bled men and women for transformation. By autumn, 2 more laborers had vanished. One was found wandering the edge of the marsh, barefoot and unable to speak, his body bearing thin, precise burns along the inside of his arms, the kind left by heated wires drawn slowly across the skin. The other was never found at all, though Whitcomb kept a length of coarse rope coiled neatly in his private quarters, still damp from recent use. He never hurried these acts. Each was prepared with the same precision as a business contract, each victim chosen for a reason that made sense only to him. The parish saw in Whitcomb a savior, a man willing to spend without asking for his name to be carved above the church door. But in his mind, the building was not a monument to God. It was a vessel, a structure designed to contain and control, to create spaces where suffering could be engineered into something pure and irreversible. Every stone laid, every nail driven brought him closer to a place where his experiments could continue unseen. And as the walls of the new wing rose, Whitcomb began to imagine the sound they would hold, not hymns or sermons, but the quiet gasps of endurance breaking one life at a time. It began on an ordinary Sunday, one of those spring mornings when the air in St. Anselm's parish carried the scent of damp earth from the fields. The altar boy, Thomas Merrick, had served at Mass with his usual obedience, his small hands steady as he carried the cruets of wine and water to the altar. There was nothing unusual in the way he bowed before the crucifix, nothing to suggest that by the time the sun set he would be gone. Parishioners remembered seeing him near the sacristy after the final hymn, tugging at the hem of his cassock as if waiting for someone to speak to him. No one noticed when he failed to emerge with the others. The locked doors of the church gave the comfort of security, but they also concealed what no one yet dared imagine. For the first week, the search was quiet, as though the town hoped silence would coax him home. Father Hayes announced from the pulpit that prayers would be offered for Thomas's safe return, his voice calm but clipped, as if he already knew the prayers would fail. Samuel Whitcomb donated food for the volunteers who combed the woods and creek beds. He walked with them for part of the day, asking gentle questions about the boy's temperament, his friends, his family. His concern appeared sincere, but he never lingered long enough to hear their answers. The days stretched into weeks, and hope thinned until it was no more than a thread pulled taut between grief and resignation. When they finally found Thomas, it was not in the woods or the river, but in the cellar beneath the parish itself. The discovery came by accident when a workman sent to check the foundation noticed a faint odor rising from a narrow, unused stairwell. At the bottom, in the damp, airless dark, sat the boy. He was upright in a wooden chair, his head tilted slightly to one side, his eyes open and glassy. His mouth had been sewn shut with coarse black twine, the stitches crude but tight, cutting deep into the corners of his lips. His hands rested on his knees, palms upward, as though still waiting to receive the communion he would never take again. The coroner's report, though brief, told more than anyone wished to know. Inside his throat and stomach they found a rosary, every bead intact, swallowed one link at a time. The chain had left faint impressions along his tongue and the back of his throat, as though forced in slowly, deliberately, each bead marking a prayer spoken under duress. His lungs had collapsed not from a single violent act, but from the gradual narrowing of his airway as the beads filled his throat, suffocating him in increments. This was not the work of someone in haste. This was patient, deliberate cruelty, administered with the precision of a ritual. The cellar walls bore no signs of struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no marks on the floor, nothing to suggest resistance. Whoever had done this had chosen a method that erased panic, replacing it with the slow dread of inevitability. It was the kind of death that demanded submission, each prayer wrung from the victim in exchange for the next breath. The mind behind it had not only killed Thomas, it had shaped his final hours into an act of devotion twisted into blasphemy. In the days after the discovery, the town moved through a haze of disbelief. Parents kept their children close but still attended Mass as though the church itself might be the only place left untouched by such violence. Yet the sanctuary was not free of its own shadow. On the Sunday after Thomas was found, the cross above the altar bled more heavily than anyone had seen before. It was not a bead this time, but a slow, steady line that traced down the carved foot of Christ, pooling on the altar cloth before Hayes stepped forward to wipe it away. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as he folded the stained linen and placed it out of sight. Whitcomb sat in the front pew, his expression unreadable. To most he appeared grief-stricken, his head bowed, his hands clasped. But his eyes, when they lifted toward the cross, did not hold sorrow. They held a kind of calculation, as if weighing the significance of the blood against the work that had been done. In his mind, the connection between the act and the sign was no coincidence. He saw the bleeding not as a condemnation but as confirmation, a response from something greater, an acknowledgement that the suffering had meaning beyond the life it ended. The cellar was sealed after Thomas's burial, but in the minds of those who had descended its steps, the air down there would always feel heavy. The image of the boy, stitched mouth, silent prayers, rosary swallowed like a chain binding him to his fate, lodged deep in their thoughts, resurfacing in dreams. Some began to see the cross's bleeding as a curse, others as a warning, but no one dared to voice the possibility that it was neither. And in the quiet of his study, Whitcomb considered what would come next, his thoughts already moving toward the next soul whose endurance would be tested bead by bead, breath by breath. They found the ledger by accident, hidden behind a false panel in Whitcomb's study. It was a narrow book bound in cracked leather, its pages filled in an immaculate, unhurried hand. The first glance suggested it was no more than a list of parish donations, each name carefully written in columns with small symbols beside them. But the longer they studied it, the colder the air seemed to grow. The symbols were not decorative marks or clerical shorthand. They were precise, historical, and deliberate. Each one matched a documented method of punishment from the medieval Inquisition, drawn with the accuracy of someone who had studied them not as curiosities but as instructions. The heretic's fork, the pear of anguish, the iron collar, the breaking wheel. Their grim shapes translated into coded emblems that only Whitcomb seemed to understand. Every parishioner's name had a mark. Some had more than one. The investigators did not need to know the specifics to sense the intent. The ledger was not a record of charity or discipline. It was a plan. The names were not written in the order of the pews or by household, but by a sequence only Whitcomb knew. A progression of acts meant to escalate in cruelty, each one following the logic of an ancient ritual brought into the present with industrial precision. In the margins were brief notes, short phrases like "slow to kneel" or "spoke out of turn," petty observations that in Whitcomb's mind had grown into capital offenses. The punishments were not chosen to match the crime. They were chosen to mold the victim into something he believed they should have been all along. The seamstress was the first to be taken after the ledger's discovery, though no one yet connected her fate to the marks on the page. Her name had been written in a steady hand beside the symbol for the meat hook, a method once used in Spanish prisons to display the condemned. but here adapted with an engineer's refinement. She had been known for her quick tongue and her habit of carrying rumors between the houses of the town. Whitcomb had listened to her often enough to know the rhythm of her speech, how her words came in bursts and pauses like the ticking of a clock. He told himself that silencing her was an act of correction, a form of mercy through suffering. She was found in her workroom 2 days after she had last been seen at market. The room smelled faintly of iron and damp cloth. Her body hung from 2 thick hooks driven through the ribs beneath each arm, the flesh stretched and tearing under the weight. A metal rod had been set behind her spine to keep her upright, preventing her from collapsing and hastening death. This was not a killing meant to be quick. It was meant to prolong the moment when the mind turns inward, when every breath is measured against the agony of taking it. She had been left water within reach, enough to keep her alive just long enough for the pain to strip away everything but remorse. Whether she truly repented for her gossip before death no one could say, but the expression frozen on her face, eyes wide, jaw clenched against the black thread sewn through her lips, suggested she had been given no choice but to try. The shock of her death spread quickly, but in a town already burdened by the disappearance of an altar boy and the unease of a bleeding cross, people learned to speak of such things in lowered voices. Father Hayes preached on the dangers of idle speech and the sanctity of the tongue, and though he never mentioned the seamstress by name, the congregation understood. Whitcomb sat among them, still and attentive, the image of a man grieving the decay of moral order. No one imagined that in the desk drawer of his study the ledger remained open to the next name on the list, the next symbol already chosen. What unsettled the few who dared think of it was the feeling that none of this was random. The deaths were different in method but identical in intent. Each was shaped with the care of a craftsman, each carried out in a way that left no doubt it had been personal. The coded marks in the ledger were not idle references to history. They were a blueprint for the purification of the parish, one body at a time. The psychological weight of that realization pressed on the investigators who handled the book. It was not simply the record of a killer. It was the theology of one. And in Whitcomb's mind, the work had only begun. The room was not on any blueprint, not even in the oldest parish records. It was found when a loose panel in the rectory's hallway wall gave way under a carpenter's hand, revealing a narrow passage that led to a door of blackened oak. Behind it, the air was still and heavy as if it had been sealed for years. The walls were bare stone, cold and damp, but the focus of the room was unmistakable. A row of iron chairs bolted to the floor, their armrests and backplates fitted with heavy clamps. They were not designed for restraint alone. They were designed to tighten in small, almost imperceptible increments. At first, a prisoner could sit upright without pain. Hours later, the clamps would begin to press against bone and joint, just enough to send a pulse of discomfort through the body. Day by day, the pressure would increase until the victim could no longer tell where their flesh ended and the iron began. In the ceiling's corners, crude brass tubes were fixed like the mouthpieces of some unseen instrument. When investigators turned the mechanism in the wall, the room filled with the low, unbroken swell of Gregorian chants, ancient, solemn, and inescapable. The sound was not loud enough to deafen, but it was constant, woven into the stone like a heartbeat. It offered no relief in silence, no change in pitch or melody. It was the kind of sound that could anchor itself into the mind, stretching seconds into hours, hours into days. Coupled with the absence of food, the effect was not immediate agony but a steady disassembly of the self. The body grew weaker as the mind circled endlessly around the unchanging notes until both reached collapse in the same breath. Father Hayes called them tests of faith when questioned, speaking of early monastic practices in which the unworthy were purified through discomfort, hunger, and repetition. He spoke as though this was mercy, as though what was done here was not cruelty but refinement. But the investigators saw it differently. This was not the crude discipline of centuries past. It was engineered suffering, pain applied with the accuracy of a clockmaker. The clamps tightened not by chance or whim, but on a schedule so exact that the bruises bloomed in symmetrical arcs across the flesh. Even the intervals of water allowed to the prisoners seemed calculated to keep them alive just long enough for the seizures to begin. The first body linked to the room was a traveling cobbler who had been working on repairs in the parish for several weeks before vanishing. He was found in an unmarked grave behind the rectory garden, his limbs twisted from prolonged confinement. The muscles in his arms and legs had withered unevenly, showing the exact sequence in which the clamps had closed. His eardrums bore no damage, but there was a kind of slackness to his facial muscles, the expressionless mask of someone who had been drawn too far inward to return. The chants had not only broken his body, they had erased the part of him that recognized his own name. Hayes insisted such outcomes were rare, claiming that most who endured the process emerged renewed. But the ledger told another story. Each session in the room was logged with the precision of an accountant balancing accounts. Entries noted the starting clamp width, the duration of exposure to the chants, the intervals between meals. Victims were referred to by initials only, but the dates matched the disappearances that had begun to pepper the town's memory. The cruelty was hidden beneath the language of piety, but it was cruelty all the same, made worse by the belief that it was righteous. For Whitcomb, the room was more than a chamber of discipline. It was a proving ground. Those who survived it, he believed, were stripped of defiance, their will reshaped to fit the contours of obedience. Those who did not survive were failures of flesh, examples to be quietly removed and replaced. In his mind, there was no moral difference between crafting a fine piece of furniture and crafting the conditions of a human breaking. Both required patience, precision, and a refusal to let sentiment interfere. When the investigators sealed the room, the chants fell silent for the first time in years. But those who had stood inside claimed the sound lingered in their minds long after, returning in the quiet moments before sleep, pulling them back into the stone-walled dark. And somewhere in the parish, Whitcomb studied the list of names yet untouched, knowing that the room was not gone, only hidden until the walls could be made to open again. The night of Good Friday settled over St. Anselm's like a shroud, the air cold enough to stiffen fingers but not enough to drive the parish indoors. Whitcomb had announced the procession as an act of devotion, a way to honor the suffering of Christ through humility and silence. It was to begin at midnight in the cemetery, the hour when he said the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. Participants arrived in small groups, their faces hidden beneath coarse linen hoods, their wrists linked by short lengths of chain so they could walk only in unison. Each was given a slender beeswax candle lit at the cemetery gate. The flames cast just enough light to reveal the path between the graves, but not enough to see far ahead. The chains kept the line tight, and the hoods narrowed the world to the flicker of wax and the sound of boots on frozen earth. Whitcomb walked at the head, his own candle unlit, his hand resting lightly on the chain as if guiding a team of oxen through a narrow pass. The rules had been explained hours earlier. No speaking, no stopping, no adjusting the candle. Each participant was to hold it upright, the slow burn of the wick bringing the flame closer to their skin as they walked. In the 15th century rite he claimed to be reviving, the candle symbolized the soul's endurance, its light kept alive even in suffering. But Whitcomb had altered the tradition. The candles were thicker, burning slower, their heat lingering against the flesh until the first blister rose, then deepened to a raw sting that made the fingers twitch involuntarily. The path wound deeper into the cemetery, past the older stones where names had been worn away by rain. The night air smelled faintly of earth recently turned, though no new burials had been recorded that week. Those who faltered were easy to spot. A stumble, a muffled hiss of pain as the wax spilled over the fingers. In the old rite, the weak would be led aside to rest and pray. Here, Whitcomb had other plans. When the first man dropped to his knees, unable to keep the candle upright as the burn seared into his palm, two of Whitcomb's hired attendants stepped from the shadows. They cut his chain, dragged him from the line, and led him toward a waiting grave at the edge of the grounds. The others could hear the soft thud of a body hitting the dirt, then the low murmur of recitation as ash was poured into his open mouth. The shovels began their work before the man's breathing had stopped. No one broke the silence. Fear tightened the chain more effectively than any lock could. As they moved forward, the line passed the grave without pause. Each hooded head turned slightly away. The ash ritual was repeated twice more before the procession was half over. The second victim, a woman in her 40s, had dropped her candle entirely, the waxed wick rolling into the frost and dying in a hiss of smoke. She was pulled from the line, her hands bound behind her, her hood removed long enough for the ash to be shoveled between her teeth before the cloth was drawn tight again. The third, a boy barely old enough to serve at the altar, made the mistake of trying to blow out the flame before it reached his skin. His gasp was swallowed by the dark before the ground did the same. Whitcomb kept count. Each faltering step, each shift of weight as the heat reached the bone was noted in his mind like a merchant tallying his goods. This was not punishment for failure, it was proof of weakness, a sorting of the worthy from the unworthy. Those who reached the end of the path with their candles still lit, their palms raw and trembling, were not rewarded with comfort. They were made to kneel at the foot of the tallest cross in the cemetery while Whitcomb walked among them, inspecting each burn as if reading scripture written in flesh. His expression never shifted from its calm mask, but in the reflection of his eyes, the flames danced like small victories. By the time the procession ended, 5 graves had been filled. The ash clung to the lips of the buried, black smears on faces that would never be seen again. The survivors were released from their chains and told to leave their candles at the base of the cross. The wax lay in misshapen clumps where it had dripped onto the frozen grass, still warm to the touch. No one spoke as they left the cemetery, but the sound of shovels striking earth lingered in their ears long after the gate closed behind them. Whitcomb remained among the stones, his unlit candle still in hand, as if waiting for the ground itself to acknowledge his work. In his mind, the procession had been a success, not because it honored any sacred tradition, but because it had proven again that pain, applied with precision, could divide a flock into those who could be broken and those who could be remade. The parish infirmary had always been a quiet place, a narrow room of whitewashed walls and simple cots where the occasional fevered child or farmhand with a broken limb might be brought for care. But in the weeks after the cemetery procession, its purpose shifted. The change was invisible to most, a locked cabinet added near the back, a thicker door on the supply room, a key that never left Whitcomb's pocket. It was here that the crude surgical tools were found, laid out in precise rows on a table that had once held bowls of broth and folded blankets. They were not the instruments of a healer. The hand drills were old, their wooden handles worn smooth, their bits honed to points capable of piercing bone. There were metal retractors, blunt chisels, lengths of cord stiff with dried residue. A bucket in the corner held strips of cloth torn from garments that had been used to gag or bind. The floor beneath the table bore faint stains, darkened in places where the boards had absorbed more than water. The records uncovered later told the rest. In Whitcomb's careful script were notes drawn from the writings of 19th-century asylum doctors and the earliest experiments of neurosurgeons who believed madness could be drained from the mind by altering the skull. But where those men had spoken of science, Whitcomb spoke of sin. He described the skull as a vessel, sealed too tightly around the corrupt thoughts that festered in the brain. A small opening, he wrote, could release the weight of guilt, allowing the soul to rise again. There was no mention of anesthesia in his notes, only the need for clarity of confession during the process, the patient's voice serving as proof that the sin was leaving the body. The victims were not strapped to hospital beds. They were placed in wooden frames of Whitcomb's own design, devices that held the body rigid from neck to ankle. The head was locked in a padded brace, but the eyes were left free, pried open with fish hooks anchored to the frame so that nothing could be hidden from the light above. Once fixed in place, the subject was questioned, at first in a calm, even tone, then with an insistence that brooked no refusal. Each confession was written in a leather-bound ledger by a scribe who sat just out of the victim's line of sight. The drill came only after the words slowed, after the pen began to lift from the page. It began as a low whine, the bit turning slowly until it found purchase in bone. The sensation was not a sharp pain but a deep, nauseating pressure, a vibration that moved through the skull and down into the spine. Most victims tried to continue speaking, forcing the words out between shallow breaths. That was when Whitcomb leaned close, encouraging them to finish, to let the last of it out before the opening was made. The first recorded subject was a miller accused of stealing grain from the parish stores. He had denied it in public, but under the brace and the hooks his voice cracked. He admitted not only to the theft but to other trespasses no one had suspected. The beating of his children, the sale of watered flour to the poorest families. The drill entered his skull just above the temple, and the scribe recorded his final coherent words before the rest dissolved into moans, then to a wet, uneven sobbing that no longer formed language. Whitcomb took this as proof that the sin had been released, that what remained was pure and speechless. The man was left in his frame overnight, his head bandaged loosely, and was found dead by morning, his face still fixed toward the light. Others followed, a school teacher accused of favoring certain pupils over others, a merchant who had charged widows more than men for the same goods. Their offenses were petty compared to the punishment, but Whitcomb saw no scale of sin, only the opportunity for correction. Each session was timed, the number of turns of the drill noted, the shift from confession to incoherence marked as a critical moment in the cleansing. It was a process refined over weeks, each death adding to his understanding of the line between endurance and collapse. To outsiders, the infirmary remained a place of care, its windows lit in the evening with the same steady glow they had always shown. No screams were heard from outside. The thick stone walls and the positioning of the room saw to that. Those who entered on Whitcomb's summons did so quietly, their absence afterward explained as illness that had taken a sudden, fatal turn. But for those who saw the frame, the hooks, and the ledger, the truth was clear. This was not medicine. It was ritual, a carefully constructed theater in which pain was both the instrument and the proof of redemption. Whitcomb kept the tools clean and oiled, returning each to its place after use. To him, the work was not gruesome but necessary, the closest a man could come to touching the soul of another. And as he closed the infirmary door each night, he knew the next name in his ledger would soon take its place in the frame, eyes fixed on the light, waiting for the sin to be drilled away into silence. By the time spring gave way to the heavy air of summer, the killings had become part of the parish's unspoken rhythm. There were no public accusations, no trials, no open mourning. People simply vanished, and in their place came the steady, undeniable bleeding of the altar cross. At first it had been a single bead, wiped away before Mass began. Then it grew into a small streak. Now it was a constant seeping, a thin red line that formed during the homily and reached the altar cloth by the final hymn. Father Hayes would pause, as if moved by the Spirit, step forward and blot it with a clean square of linen. The stains never came out in the wash. Each cloth was folded, stored, and replaced with another the following week. The drawers in the sacristy were filling with them, stacked in neat piles, the dark patches growing darker with time. The townsfolk whispered that the blood came from the victims, carried from their bodies in some unseen way, drawn to the cross as if it were claiming its share. The theory was never spoken in daylight, only in kitchens with shutters drawn, but the belief took root. The names of the missing became linked to the Sundays when the bleeding was heaviest. People began to count the drops, to measure them against the memory of who had last been seen alive. Some saw it as divine judgment, others as a curse, but none dared to confront Hayes or Whitcomb. The church had become the only place where the truth could be glimpsed, and also the one place where no one felt safe. A former altar boy, now grown and living in another county, returned one afternoon to visit his family. Over supper, his hands trembled when he spoke of the times he had been made to clean the cross after weekday masses. Hayes had given him the cloth and told him to work slowly, to be careful not to scratch the wood. The boy had followed the instructions, tracing each groove of the carved figure with the edge of the linen. It was then, he said, that he felt it, a faint, steady pulse under his fingertips like a living thing. At first he thought it was his own heartbeat echoing in his hands, but the rhythm was slower, heavier, and it did not stop when he paused. He never told anyone until now, and even then he spoke in a whisper, as if the cross could still hear him from across the years. This story spread quickly, adding a new layer to the town's fear. If the cross was alive in some way, then the blood was not only a sign, it was a hunger being fed. People began avoiding the front pews, leaving the first 3 rows empty during services. They kept their eyes down when passing the altar, and those chosen to serve at Mass did so with a stiffness that betrayed their dread. Yet the bleeding never stopped, and the linens kept piling up. The stains became a record of complicity, each one a reminder that the town had seen enough to know and had chosen silence. Whitcomb moved through all of this like a man above suspicion. He attended every Mass, his head bowed in apparent reverence, but he always looked up when Hayes stepped to the cross with the linen. He would watch the wiping with an intensity that made some uneasy, as if he were measuring not just the amount of blood but the act of removing it. The killing served his purpose, but the bleeding had become something else to him, a visible tally, an unbroken chain of confirmation that his work was not only effective but acknowledged by whatever force he believed he served. When a young widow disappeared after being seen entering the church at dusk, the cross bled so heavily the next morning that it left a streak across Hayes's palm as he blotted it. The sight made some in the congregation gasp, but no one moved to leave. The fear had become so complete that it bound them in place. Every parishioner understood that speaking out would not only put them in danger, but would make them the next name linked to the blood. Silence had become their only defense, and even that felt fragile. The town's complicity grew heavier with each passing week. Those who suspected the truth found themselves attending Mass more regularly, as if by showing devotion they could mark themselves as untouchable. Others began to bring small offering, coins, bread, candles, leaving them at the foot of the cross without speaking. These gifts were not for God, but for whatever kept the blood flowing. Hayes accepted them without comment. Whitcomb's ledger grew, and the cross, pulsing beneath its layers of carved oak, bled on. When the authorities finally came for Whitcomb and Father Hayes, it was not with the thunder of righteous outrage, but with the tired caution of men who knew they were stepping into something that had already swallowed others whole. The investigators had pieced together fragments: the ledger, the hidden rooms, the graves in the cemetery, the vanished townsfolk. But they had no clear thread to tie the axe to the men without the voices of those who had seen. At first, a handful of witnesses agreed to speak. They described strange summonses to the rectory, hours spent in locked rooms, the sound of chanting from behind closed doors. Some recalled the bleeding cross, the way Hayes touched it with a care that felt more like ownership than reverence. Others remembered Whitcomb's quiet questions about their families, their habits, their sins, questions that seemed harmless at the time but now read as selections from a list he kept in his mind. But by the time the case reached the formal inquiry, those voices had changed. In the courthouse, under the dull echo of official proceedings, witnesses hesitated, spoke in half-sentences, or claimed their memories had been mistaken. One man who had earlier described being restrained in the windowless chamber now insisted he had only dreamed it. A woman who had sworn she saw attendants drag her neighbor toward an open grave now said it had been too dark to be sure. Each retraction left the room heavier, the chain of evidence thinner. The judges shifted in their seats, uneasy but bound by the rules of proof. Then came the confessions. Both men submitted them in writing, not as admissions of guilt, but as theological essays, dense with citations from church history, medieval penitential rites, and obscure canon law. Whitcomb's document was the longer, spanning nearly 200 pages in a script so precise it seemed mechanical. He argued that each death was not an act of cruelty but of spiritual correction, a targeted removal of moral decay that threatened the body of the faithful. He described the methods in the language of sacraments, the drilling of skulls as the opening of the vessel, the tightening of clamps as the narrowing of the soul's path to grace. Each act was paired with a historical precedent, reframed not as punishment but as restoration. Hayes's confession echoed these points, though with the voice of a pastor rather than an engineer. Speaking of the weight of sin and the need for the shepherd to cull the diseased sheep for the sake of the flock. Outside the courtroom, the pressure on the witnesses grew. Those who had recanted were left alone, but those who still held to their original statements found themselves followed, their windows broken at night, their livestock dead in the morning. One man returned home from the inquiry to find his front door nailed shut and a small scrap of linen stained dark nailed to the frame. A week later, he withdrew his testimony. Others vanished altogether, and when they were found, it was never alive. The most chilling of these discoveries came on a Sunday morning, when parishioners entering St. Anselm's found the poor box by the door unusually heavy. Inside were coins, scraps of paper with the names of saints, and 2 human tongues, the edges ragged where they had been cut. No one claimed to recognize them, though in the weeks that followed 2 more witnesses failed to appear for questioning. The authorities pressed forward, but each loss of testimony weakened the case. The confessions, steeped in the language of faith, confused the matter further. There were those in the town who began to believe them, or at least to believe that the acts, however brutal, had been justified. They spoke in low tones about the dangers of pride, the need for obedience, the role of suffering in salvation. The bleeding of the cross had not stopped during the proceedings, and for some, it was proof that these men were chosen instruments of something greater than the law. In the end, the inquiry produced nothing more than a set of sealed documents marked for the archives and never opened again. Whitcomb and Hayes returned to their positions without ceremony, their authority intact, though now laced with the knowledge that they could withstand even the weight of the state. The townsfolk learned the deeper lesson, that silence was survival, and that the price of speaking was paid not in coin, but in flesh. In the weeks after, the poor box remained at the church door, its mouth open to receive the offerings of the faithful. And though no one said it aloud, everyone knew that it could just as easily hold another tongue if the need arose. The fire that gutted St. Anselm's in the winter of 1901 was ruled an accident, though no one could say with certainty what had started it. Some claimed a lamp had been left burning in the sacristy, others that lightning struck the bell tower in the early hours before dawn. The truth was never pursued with much vigor. By the time the flames were out, the nave had collapsed into smoldering ruin, and the altar, along with the cross that had bled for years, was gone. Or so the town told itself. Those who had carried water to the fire line swore they saw it standing even as the roof caved in, the wood blackened but unburned, a dark sheen still running from the carved feet. When the wreckage cooled and crews began clearing it away, no trace of the cross was found among the charred timbers. No one admitted to taking it, but in the weeks that followed, the ground where the altar had once stood remained damp even in frost, the soil stained with something that rain could not wash out. The parish was not rebuilt. Instead, the land was leveled and fenced, and within a year a memorial was raised. It was a low stone wall in a rough semicircle with 3 plaques set into its face. Each bore the same inscription in deep, unwavering letters. In Cruce, Salus. In the cross, salvation. There were no names, no dates, no explanation for passers-by. The absence of names was not an oversight, but a choice, as if the town had agreed that to speak them aloud was to invite something back. Officially, the memorial was to honor the parishioners lost to illness and misfortune in the church's long history. Unofficially, it was a marker for those who had been taken by Whitcomb's hand and Hayes's sanction, though in the retelling guilt blurred into the idea that perhaps the cross itself had claimed them. Families came to lay flowers, but never openly. They did so at night, leaving them in silence as if the stones might overhear and judge their grief. In the years after the raising, county law quietly changed. All charitable institutions, churches included, were now required to register publicly not only their funding but the nature of their activities. The law was written without reference to St. Anselm's, but everyone knew its origin. Officials referred to Whitcomb's private acts in tones that suggested scandal without speaking of murder. It became illegal for such institutions to operate rooms or wards not listed in their charters. On paper, this was progress. In reality, it was a boundary that only mattered to those willing to obey it, and those who had seen what Whitcomb had built knew men like him did not stop because of rules. They simply learned to hide their work deeper. The stories did not fade. In some households, they were told as cautionary tales to children, warnings about straying from the path of righteousness. In others, they were whispered like family shame, the details shifting with each retelling. One thread remained constant. The cross's blood had never dried. Some claimed it seeped into the ground where the altar once stood, spreading under the fence line, into the roots of the trees nearby. Hunters passing through swore the soil there was always soft, even in drought, and that animals avoided it. On the coldest nights, it was said a faint glisten could still be seen on the grass, catching moonlight like a thin film of oil. Whitcomb himself vanished from the county records after 1901. No one could say where he had gone, though a handful of letters surfaced decades later, each in his unmistakable script, written to a bishop in another state. They spoke of unripened work and fields left fallow. Hayes remained in the area until his death, taking a position at a smaller parish, his sermons quieter but his influence no less felt. Those who had lived through the St. Anselm years learned to keep their eyes on the floor when his name was spoken. Time turned the memorial into part of the landscape, another weathered marker among many. Outsiders passing through the town might stop to puzzle over the Latin, but the locals gave it little outward notice. Yet the weight of it remained. Those who stood before it too long sometimes spoke of a pressure in the chest, a feeling like standing in a closed room without air. A few said they heard something faint, not words but a low hum, steady and patient, as if the stones were waiting. And so the land kept its secret and the town its silence. The memorial still stands, the ground still damp in places, the law still in place for those willing to follow it. But in the long shadow of what happened at St. Anselm's, a question lingers, passed down in whispers and uneasy glances. What do you think? Could this happen again?